Hello, I'm Papa Biceps. You're watching the Thorin YouTube channel, and remember, don't fuck with Papito.
Trade-fragging saw the concept that when you as a player are killed, but your teammate is able to kill the opponent who killed you, this is a trade frag. This is because you have traded your life, or your opponent has at least, your teammate has at least, has traded your life in exchange for the opponent's life. Now, this is most crucially applied as a core concept of Counter-Strike play for the terrorist side. In fact, generally, it is the core concept that you have to be able to understand as a mechanism if you want to be able to appreciate the tactical and strategical side of Counter-Strike. Because on the terrorist side, you can always, as a general principle, bring more men, more terrorists to a bomb site than there can be CTs holding it. In the vast majority of cases, obviously, if the CTs just stack the site blindly, that might not always be the case. If the CTs read what you're doing at some point in the mid-round and they rotate people over early, that also might not be the case. But in the vast majority of cases, your luxury as a terrorist is once you decide what site to hit, and generally you're going to pick the site that you think has the least CTs in it, you can bring more terrorists than there are CTs. So you have the numbers advantage. So as such, the reason trade fragging becomes the core concept of terrorist side play in competitive Counter-Strike is that when you have more men than they do, then trading 1-for-1 your entry for one of their defenders is always going to be a small win for your side, since it will then result in there being less counter-terrorists in the bomb site, meaning if you trade again, now you've lost 2 people, but they've lost 2 people, but hopefully that's all the counter-terrorists in the site. So you now have control of the site. With that control, you can then plant the bomb, at which point you take control of the round entirely because you now become the defensive side, and now the CTs must attack onto where you are, and they've lost players. So they don't have the same luxury of bringing more men to the bomb site for the retake than you do necessarily, assuming you've traded accurately and you didn't lose like 2 or 3 people per 1 CT that you killed off. So also, obviously, the bomb exploding is the ideal scenario for the terrorists. The problem the T side has, and why it's not as simple as that, is when the terrorists go into a site, this is the reason why it's so essential to understand why trade fragging is the ideal. The ideal isn't like you're just going to run in and kill everyone. That's not as likely, because the problem terrorist side always faces is that while they can bring more men to a site, they never know the exact number of CTs in a site, the location of the CTs in the site most often, or how the CTs will choose to play that site once the terrorists' entry. So when the terrorists send in their entry players, just the first people who go into the site, they need to have follow-up go with the first person and usually the second person as well. That allows the first person into the site to scout enemy positions, to gain ground in the site that the others can now take up behind him, to distract the other players entering because he's the first person the CTC. And if possible, obviously the ideal scenario would be that he also gets the kill or he puts some damage down onto one of the defending players in the site from an aim duel of his own. But even if he doesn't get the kill, even if he doesn't do any damage at all, as long as he can either A, give information, or ideally B, have his death traded immediately by one of the terrorists behind him for the CT that killed him, then it's fine, and it's still a plus, a negative, a net positive for the terrorist side. An even trade, as a principle, is generally always a win for the T side because of this factor, and then the imbalance that happens when they plant the bomb on the terrorist side. So good examples of this in pro play, if you want to go and look them up. All of MSL's teams, when he's been the in-game leader, have run this system. So go look at MSL's style with AZ in 2015, with Kirby in 2016, with Config in 2017. He basically just inserted a different star player as the follow-up to his entry and used this principle to have some pretty good T-sides across the years. Obviously, one of the all-time classics in CSGO would be Freiburg in the early NIP of 2012 to 2013, where he was the hard entry, and then Forrest, a fabulously talented aimer, was the follow-up. And so you were getting Freiburg going in, doing damage, seeing where people are, and then Forrest's coming in, and he's taking an aim duel where he himself might have full health versus an enemy with 50 health, and he's already the best aimer at the time in the game, so he's going to absolutely clean up these scenarios. Now, part of the reason why this is a core concept, because it's not as obvious as it will seem once you understand the concept, is that generally Counter-Strike players don't want to die. It sucks. They don't like it. From playing individually and rising through the ranks, it feels like a really negative outcome to the round. And crucially, not only do people not want to die, they hate to die when they die in a scenario where they didn't get a fair aim duel, where they couldn't actually aim on the person, even get any bullets off, or have a chance of killing him because he maybe was behind a box or on an off angle, or they were flashed initially. That's going to be one of the most frustrating ways to die, and it's why so few players like to be an entry fragger or want to play on the front end of the equation. Most people like to be middle to the back of the pack and have the advantage of knowing where enemies are, people having died already, people having been traded for. That's what people prefer. So the problem is, most people want to have the opponent come to them or know the exact location of the opponent. Now, that can even be a problem at the pro level. There are certain players refuse to go in first, or if you make them an entry fragger, will do it in a selfish manner, or won't just give themselves entirely for the team and the player behind themselves. I've heard many stories over the years of pro players who didn't agree with this concept or didn't want to be the one who did this and didn't see the overall net positive for their whole team, even though they individually might be dying and being put in bad scenarios. That's why the trade fragging concept is so key, even at the top level of the game, because it's a way to, first of all, convince players to play an entry style, and that if they die, it's not necessarily their fault. They haven't ruined their part of the round. In fact, it can be a step along the path to victory for their team in the round, in which case, even though they might have died without getting a kill off, they did their job. So you convince the entries that their responsibility is different from getting kills, as opposed to a lurker or an AWP or whatever it might be. You can also then convince the players who are the follow-up not to bait. That instead, when their teammate dies, they have even more of an impetus, an incentive to go in, because they now have some sense of where the CTs are, what the CT setup is like, how the CTs are playing, if then some damage has been done to the CTs, and they now have a fight that might be a positive for them to take, not only to take the ground in the site, but because they might be fighting with better health than a gun versus an opponent with perhaps worse health, worse positioning, and worse gun. So it's a fight they would want to take, rather than them being someone who says, oh, well, I'm going to pull back because he just died, so I need to be sure of, like, when I take the same duel, which can be a natural, selfish, individual player's reaction to that. Because in doing this, trade fragging, it gives you a clear idea of how to take over sites and areas without having to think that you have to shoot everyone in the head and win every aim duel. You don't. You just have to trade effectively as terrorists, and it's all a plus for you. Now, this also is a factor that, this is why it favours the T's as default. Generally, it favours the team with more players. So obviously, as CT, it can favour you if you have 3 players retaking against 2 players and the bomb's down. So now it's reverted. You're the offensive side now, and they're the defensive side defending that planted bomb. Obviously, in that scenario, it's fine for your guy to run in, get killed, as long as you then trade, because you're still narrowing the numbers down and you have the numbers advantage overall. And that's a way to retake the site, it's a way to reclaim certain area and now isolate a certain opponent. 2 players, 1 player, that is the last one you have to kill, and now you know where he isn't and therefore where he might be by process of elimination. So one of the issues here, obviously, is that at the lower levels of play, particularly where people are only playing individually in matchmaking or on public servers, people generally are baiting there because they don't want to go in and die and they can't trust their teammates. So you need to make the clear distinction between baiting, where you don't in any way actually opportunistically benefit from the person's death, you just bait them and then you get a kill later that isn't even necessarily one that you had an advantage in. You take the same sort of fight he was taking without information or without following up on him. There's a distinction between that and trade fragging, which is actually a team concept that professionals are running. Now, you might say, why do you need to trade frag at all? Why not just double peek? Why not have 2 people step out at once, 2 people firing at one guy? Isn't that an advantage? Sure, on a level it can be, but that also presumes that there's only going to be 1 person fighting against you. What if there's 2 or 3 people looking at that area? Now you step out, you might all both just get killed without the chance for the advantage of transmitting some information, of distracting from someone, of doing damage, and then another person steps out onto that player. There's also, you can't kind of disrupt what the CT does as much. If you all step out at once, he's just going to keep firing. He's going to try and kill you all. He's not going to be thrown off by thinking, do I reposition? Do I reload? It's not going to be as simple. So it's a lot easier in some senses for the CT to get the second kill if you both step out at once. Better to let him try to reposition or pull back, therefore he has to give up ground in an angle, therefore you can step out into an angle that didn't exist for you before because the CT was watching it, or try and reload while you rush him down with utility or guns yourself and kill him with either one person or superior numbers. Now, what's good about this as well is it also, if you're a beginner player, should change your concept of how you play if you are on the outskirts of a map, if you are a lurker, if you are a distraction. Because if you are on the outskirts of the map without follow-up, without teammates near you, you should not be taking risky aim duels in the same fashion that you would if you were the entry or if you were part of a rush of 3 or 4 people going in, because there is no possibility for a trade. You actually are giving away an advantage to the CTs because they can kill you straight up. You don't trade on them. They now have the numbers advantage. The trade concept might not even now work for you with only 4 players if they rotate someone off after they figure out no one's traded them. Therefore, by process of elimination, you were probably a backstabbing player, a lurker, someone playing on the outskirts. You've now also signaled which site your team's very likely attacking, assuming it's not in the very middle of the round when you can still rotate. So when you're on the CT side, obviously you're looking to not get traded upon. Now, that might mean having a teammate with a counter flash once you get a kill so that you can get the fallback. That might mean killing someone but noticing that you still have enough time before the other person steps out and kills you to be able to fall back, to reposition. Crucially, if possible, to delay for time sometimes. Sometimes you don't go for the aim duel once you spot them. If you don't want to get the initial shot off, you pull back so that you're not traded upon, and now you delay for time because you know they're attacking your sites. You want to give more time for a rotation before the bomb goes down. You want a better chance of a defuse and a retake because there's going to be more time before that bomb goes down. The timer hasn't started yet. You want to force opponents, knowing that you are in the site, to try and isolate you, to rush you, to try and take up ground on you. Therefore, you can hopefully take another favourable angle or off angle. Crucially, you can now sometimes, as a CT, push the other site if you hear that it's a full hit on the site that you're not playing in. Because now that you've heard it's a full hit on that one with 3 or 4 players, you can now aggressively push out of your site rather than purely rotating through spawn, not just to be able to retake from the other side, put pressure on the map, but also because it's much less likely when you push out onto an area where there might be a terrorist that he can trade back onto you. You're taking essentially a fair aim duel, and you can even get the surprise element on him, and you don't have to worry that once you're finished spraying and killing him, someone steps out and kills you. So you can take that fight, first of all, to hold the lurker in position so he can't kill your players maybe who rotate through the mid. Also, if you kill him, you're now in a scenario where you can now pressure the map aggressively and pincer the terrorists into a site, so they're not just having to look at one angle or just the CT spawn rotation. You can now make them have to think of both sites, maybe even use their counter utility before you've entirely tried to enter the site. And this is a core concept that relates to map pressure. Now, this concept of trade fragging didn't exist in the same way in 1.6 because if you were a CT, spray was a lot more effective. Flashes and smokes were a lot less effective from the terrorist side. So you saw a lot of clips famously on Inferno as the B-site anchor player. There are tons of players who have highlight clips in movies where they just spray down 3 or 4 people running into that site, especially if they're coming through a smoke or if they have been counter-flashed, and you just get them in the head for the first 2, you spray into the bloody next one, and you've absolutely destroyed this trade fragging concept, and it's going to be a lot more difficult for them to take the B-site in that sense. So solo holds or one player killing 2 or 3 players, therefore no trade frag, were a lot more common and a lot more plausible as an expectation if you're a very skilled CT player than they are in CSGO. In CSGO, it's a lot more about rotating, it's a lot more about repositioning yourself, it's a lot more about getting the first kill but then having to fall off because it's a lot more difficult to spray and to get those multiple kills versus good teams who aren't flashed. So trading in a sense in 1.6 was even more valuable because it was more difficult. Now, this concept didn't always exist in CS history, and in fact, as I said, in CSGO, there are still some pros who their mentality isn't adjusted to it, and while they know the basics of the concept, they don't always apply it, quite frankly. In fact, when you see teams grind to a halt on T-side, look hesitant, like they don't know what to do, often this is a flaw that they don't effectively trade and play for each other in that sense. They play a little bit more baity and a little bit more hesitant to actually engage on sites using this mechanism. In the early days of CS, a lot of the game, especially in North America, was was based around individual play. You go wherever you want on the map, you take an aim duel versus a specific player that you think you can beat, or that you've got better aim than, or that you just want to open that area of the map, and you would generally selfishly play around your own aim duel, jiggle peek in a corner, trying to actually take an aim duel and fight a guy. It wasn't as much about setting up for the rest of the attack or for the follow-up guy behind you. Now, there were tactics back then, but tactics back then tended to be more pure executes, planned out attacks that I go to here and then he goes to here, and then the third person goes there, and this is what we do at this particular time. So you would have follow-up within this tactic, but it was follow-up that wasn't dynamic. It was set within the tactic of where people go and what area we're attacking. It wasn't like, right, someone died at this point, so next guy step out now, we're going to actually swarm that area, we're going to trade it, and then we're going to take that area over, then we're going to make a decision. It wasn't as much of that. So it became a core concept throughout CS history, and by the end of 1.6, it was a very well understood concept, especially by the top European teams. But I can tell you, go ask people like Lurpus, who were in-game leaders at the end, not every player knew this, and not every team knew it, and if they said they knew it, they didn't all act upon it. So this very core chess-like concept for gaining advantage, keeping advantages on your side, gaining ground without necessarily ceding advantage, it wasn't always understood and it wasn't always applied. This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Alex Adams, Eddie Wingfors, Daniel Yordanov, Robert Baxter, Travis Greb, Kyla Harris, James Harding, Caesar, and special thanks go out to Matt Shakowski and Jerky's Minion in particular. Want teasers for my upcoming content? How about asking me a question for my monthly AMA? Do you want to take part in a discussion about esports with me? How about suggesting a topic or a guest for my content? Put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today.